Hello, I'm Richard Schultz, the Blanchard Chair of Old Testament at Wheaton College.
Dr. Richard Schultz. Richard, great to have you back here on Exegetically Speaking.
Good to be here.
Good to see you. It's just a delight always to be on Wheaton's campus and to see the faculty and to see you particularly. You're always joyful. You're always happy, it seems.
Because I'm retiring.
He's retiring. That's why. Okay, that's the secret of it all, I suppose. All right, today we're going to jump right into Isaiah 28, verse 16. And this is part of a prophetic text of what's happening right before the Assyrian invasion, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what's happening here in this text?
So what we have in chapters 28 to 31 is a description of the temptation of the current king of Judah to rely on military alliances rather than rely on God's protective covenantal promises. And so they're tempted, or they're in the process actually, of sending ambassadors down to Egypt to broker a kind of defensive pact. And this emerges more clearly in the course of these chapters, whereas in chapter 28, the kind of themes are being introduced kind of more vaguely and metaphorically.
Well, the Assyrians are the superpower of
Yeah.
today. They're building and beginning to extend their empire down to the south.
Yes.
And that's going to include Israel. That's going to include Judah,
Right.
if they are unchecked.
By the time we get to 36 and 37, we have Sennacherib's invasion, where he has conquered everything except a little island around Jerusalem. So we're in that process where they're sweeping down the Mediterranean coast, down from the north, swallowing up Aram and Israel and ultimately most of Judah.
So this particular text, you said, introduces some metaphors. There's a lot about stones and Zion and foundations and those kinds of things. So take us through that.
Here it talks about establishing a cornerstone, which is the foundation, and probably it's also then alluding to the Jerusalem temple. What he will say in the next couple of verses is that he's going to use justice as kind of the plumb line to see if the people line up with his commandments. Given the fact that they don't, they're going to be judged. And the metaphors of judgment are floodwaters and hail and sweeping away their hiding place where they think they have a refuge. They've hidden themselves probably in this Egyptian alliance, but he says, you've hidden yourself with a lie, and that lie will be exposed. And he ends up saying in the end of the chapter, you've made your bed, and you're going to have to lie in it. The bed is too short to be comfortable. The blankets are too narrow to cover you. You've gotten yourself in an uncomfortable situation because you're trusting in military alliances with Egypt, another superpower, to help you against the Assyrian army rather than relying on God.
Yeah. But here now he's changing that and said, I am God.
Right.
God is the one speaking here, right?
Yeah.
And it starts out with that wonderful word, hineni.
Yeah.
Behold, look.
Yeah.
Unparalleled in a way. Right.
And that word in the prophets is always introducing something that's remarkable or significant. Pay attention to this. It's used in Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the young woman will bear a child, right? These are things that are noteworthy and important to pay attention to. And so it's here, and God is, in a sense, saying, I've established Zion as this founded, solid place. And he's talking here about the dual election of Jerusalem/Zion as his dwelling place on earth, place in space and time where God's kingdom is being manifested and developed, and the Davidic king as being the delegated authority, representative of God's rule. And so he's saying, Zion is established. I'm the one who's done it. Trust it. Trust in me. And it's interesting, you have that same verb being used. It's the verb from which we get the word amen, kind of trustworthy, and it's also used in Isaiah 7, right? If you don't trust God as reliable, he's not going to put his trust in you as a king, talking to Ahaz, right? Walter Kaiser used to say that, amen God, and he'll amen you. That verb to rely on God as opposed to relying on military strength and alliances. He said, if you believe, you won't be hastening down to Egypt which is the translation that the ESV uses. The one who believes will not be in haste. You won't be hurrying down to try to get someone to sign on the dotted line to help you out. You'll just trust in God.
Yeah, which means you'll sit back and rest in a way,
right,
and wait for God's deliverance.
And he says, in quietness and deliverance is your hope, but you won't have anything of it. You want to be active, and politically, militarily, you can understand that. But if they remember their history and all the times that God has delivered them, going way back to the Exodus and the sea, God has come through. They don't have to rely on their military strength, and they conquered the promised land in the book of Joshua, not because of their military superiority, but because God was on their side.
Right, and Gideon did the same with the Midianites. Exactly.
Right.
What's interesting to me is that God is saying, I'm the one who's laying the stone,
right,
and yet God is the stone himself.
Right. Well, in a sense, there's a debate on what the stone is, right?
Right, yeah.
Actually, the verbal tense here is, I've done it. So this is actually a past action of God where he already elected Jerusalem as his dwelling place and the Davidic king. So this is going back to the establishment of Jerusalem in the time of 1 Samuel, of David. He's already done that, and they can rely on that. Some people call that the infallibility of Zion. It's where Jeremiah will pick that up and say, nothing can happen to us. We're Zion. And he says, well, if you're disobeying me,
right,
you're not secure.
Right.
But if you're trusting in me and you're obeying me, I'll take care of you.
Do you see a temple connection here? Because the kind of buildings that had stones are not just on every corner.
Sure.
I mean, the kind of buildings that had cornerstones would be something like a temple.
Right. This is clearly a temple allusion, which is interesting because then Peter will pick this up in 1 Peter and talk about us being built into a living temple with Jesus as the chief cornerstone. And in that, we're not just stones, we're also priests, right? But he's picking up the temple analogy, which, of course, you still have the Jerusalem temple in that continuity. And so that's actually picking up the image there. I think it is intentionally. It's interesting, you have a parallel to that in Isaiah 8, and he says, if you trust in God, right, he'll be a sanctuary at Mikdash. But if you don't, he's going to be a stumbling stone, which is also picked up in the New Testament.
Yeah. That's a really interesting reading of this text.
Yeah.
So the New Testament is really taking that text, he's still using it in a temple kind of environment, and yet changing the focus from one thing to Jesus. Jesus is that cornerstone.
And the rationale for that is that the Greek translation added in there, in him, whoever trusts in him or believes in him. And the Hebrew verb has no object in Isaiah 28:16.
Just whoever believes.
Whoever believes, it's kind of an absolute, and in a sense, believing in God's establishment of Zion, right? That's kind of covenantal promises to David, etc. But the Septuagint wanted to have an object, and so they added in him, or in it, the stone, or in God. But then both Paul in Romans 9 and 10 and Peter in 1 Peter sees that in him as Jesus as the object of our faith, which is, of course, the case it is for Christians.
It could well be that the whole word group of pistuo, which is the word to believe, might more generally take that kind of object or be read more easily with that kind of object. I don't know. We'd have to get philologists on there.
Well, you go back to the Abrahamic promise where he said, Abraham believed God, right? There's that verb, believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So there's a clear example of confidence in God, trusting his promises as being reliable, even in their biological state of not likely to have children, right? He believed God. And so there's that object, but here the object is missing. And so the Septuagint filled it in. And that facilitated then the quotation and the application of Jesus, which is not uncommon, where things that are attributed to God, to Yahweh in the Old Testament, are then applied to Jesus in the New Testament.
Yeah. I know a little bit about that.
I'm sure you do. I know you do. I read some of that.
Yeah, Dr. Richard Schultz, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
You're welcome.
Dr. Richard Schultz retires in 2025 from Wheaton College after a long and distinguished career of teaching and working with students. But be not afraid. Richard is not going anywhere. He's going to hang around just so that he can do more episodes of Exegetically Speaking. If you know a person who would like to study biblical languages, please share the podcast with them. Better yet, help them to subscribe so that they can hear the podcast every time that it drops. The Exegetically Speaking podcast comes to you courtesy of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. This podcast is not free, but it is paid for. If biblical languages and exegesis seems to be your cup of tea, then today is the day to put on the kettle and boil the water. Now, before that metaphor gets completely out of hand, let's say what that means. It means go to the show notes and see how you can sign up for graduate and undergraduate programs in languages at Wheaton College. There are many talents on our podcast team. Our audio editor, my wife, Kathy Capes, our production staff in Wheaton, John Lonsma, Rebecca Larson, Jesse Dugan, our musicians, Phil Keggy and David Capes. Thanks to them all. Until next time, I am David Capes. Thanks for listening.